welcome back to Studioloo. It's Cindy. Welcome to Chapter 11, A Breach in the Bank. This is from Winter by Dallas Laura Sharp. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 11, A Breach in the Bank. The February freshet had come. We had been expecting it, but no one along Maurice River had ever seen so wild and warm and ominous a spring storm as this. So sudden and complete a break-up of winter no one could remember, nor so high a tide, so rain-thick and driving a south wind. It had begun the night before, and now, along the near noon, the river and meadows were a tumult of white waters, with the gale so strong that one could hardly hold his own on the drawbridge that groaned from pier to pier in the grip of the maddened storm. It was into the teeth of this gale that a small boy dressed in large yellow oilskins made his slow way out along the narrow bank of the river towards the sluices that controlled the tides of the great meadows. The boy was in large yellow oilskins, not dressed, no, for he was simply inside of them, his feet and hands and the top of his head having managed to work their way out. It seems, at least, that his head was partly out, for on the top of the oilskins sat a large black sou'wester, and in the arms of the oilskins lay an old army musket, so big and long that it seemed to be walking away with the oilskins, as the oilskins seemed to be walking away with the boy. I can feel the kick of that old musket yet, and the prick of that dried sandburr among which she knocked me. I can hear the rough rasping of the chafing legs of those oilskins, too, though I was not the boy this time inside of them, but I knew the boy who was, a real boy, and I know that he made his careful way along the trembling river bank out into the sunken meadows that later on I saw the river burst into and claim, and it still claims them, as I saw only last summer when, after 30 years of absence, I once more stood at the edge of the bank looking over a watery waste which was once the richest of farmlands. Never, it seemed, had the village known such wind and rain and such a tide. It was a strange, wild scene from the drawbridge, wharves obliterated, river white with flying spume and tossing ice cakes, the great bridge swaying and shrieking in the wind, and over everything the blur of the swirling rain. The little figure in yellow oilskins was not the only one that had gone along the bank since morning, for a party of men had carefully inspected every foot of the bank to the last sluice, for fear that there might be a weak spot somewhere. Let a breach occur with such a tide as this, and it could never be stopped. And now, somewhat past noon, the men were again upon the bank, as they neared 40 Forks Sluice. 5 Forks Sluice, the central and largest of the water gates. They heard a smothered boom above the scream of the wind in their ears. They were startled, but it was only the sound of a gun somewhere off in the meadow. It was the gun of the boy in the oilskins. Late that afternoon, Dr. Sam, driving home along the flooded road of the low-back swamp, caught sight as he came out in view of the river, of a little figure in yellow oilskins, away out in the meadow. The doctor stopped his horse and hallooed, but the boy did not hear. The rain on his coat, the wind, and the river in his ears drowned every other sound. The sun was falling, and as the doctor looked out over the wild scene, he put his hands to his mouth and called again. The yellow figure had been blotted out by the rain. There was no response, and the doctor drove on. Meanwhile, the boy in the yellow oilskins was splashing slowly back along the narrow, slippery clay bank. He was wet, but he was warm, and he loved the roar of the wind and the beat of the driving rain. As the mist and rain were fast mixing with the dust of the twilight, he quickened his steps. His path in places was hardly a foot wide, covered with rose and elder bushes mostly, but barren spots where holes and low-worn stretches had been recently built up with cubes of tough blue mud of the flats. The tide was already even with the top of the bank and was still rising. It leaped and hit at his feet as he picked his way along. The cakes of white ice crunched and heeled up against the bank, with here and there one flung fairly across his path. The tossing water frequently splashed across. Twice he jumped places where the tide was running over him, down into the meadows below. How quickly the night had come! It was dark when he reached 5 Forks Sluice, the middle point in the long high bank. While still some distance off he heard the sullen roar of the big sluice, through which the swollen river was trying to force its way. He paused to listen a moment. He knew the peculiar voice of every one of these gateways, as he knew every foot of the river bank. There was nothing wrong with the sullen roar, but how deep and threatening. He could feel the sound even better than he could hear it. Far down below him, he started forward to pass on, when he half felt through the long, regular throbbing of the sluice a shorter, faster, closer quiver, as of small running stream in the bank very near his feet. Dropping quickly to his knees, he laid his ear to the wet earth. A cold, black hand seemed to seize upon him. He heard the purr of running water. It must be down about 3 feet. He could distinctly feel it tearing through. Without rising, he scrambled down the meadow side of the bank to see the size of the breach. He could hear nothing of it, for the boiling at the gates of the sluice. It was so dark he could scarcely see, but near the bottom the mud suddenly caved beneath his feet, and a rush of cold water caught at his knees. The hole was greater than he feared. Crawling back to the top of the bank, he leaned out over the riverside. A large cake of ice hung in water in front of him. He pushed it aside, and bending until his face barely cleared the surface of the river, he discovered a small sucking eddy, whose swirling hole he knew ran into the breach. He edged farther out and reached down under the water and touched the upper rim of the hole. How large might it be? Swinging around, he dug his fingers into the bank and lowered himself feet first until he stood in the hole. It was the size of a small bucket, but he could almost feel it going beneath his feet, and a sudden terror took hold upon him. He was only a boy, and the dark night, the wild river, the vast sweeping storm, the roar and tremor and tumult flattened him for a moment to the ridge of the bank in a panic of fear. But he heard the water running. He felt the bank going directly beneath where he lay, and getting to his feet, he started for the village. A single hasty step, and but for the piles of the sluice, he would have plunged into the river. He must feel his way, but he never could do it in time to save the bank. The breach must be stopped at once. He must stop it and keep it stopped until the next patrol brought help. Feeling his way back, he dropped again upon his hands and knees above the breach to think for a moment. The cake of ice hung as before in the eddy. Catching it, he tipped it and thrust it down across the mouth of the hole, but it slipped from his cold fingers and dived away. He pushed down the butt of his musket, turned it flat, but it was not broad enough to cover the opening. Then he lowered himself again and stood in it, wedging the musket in between his boots, but he could feel the water still tearing at the sides and eating all the faster. He clambered back to the top of the bank, put his hand to his mouth, and shouted. The only answer was the scream of the wind and the cry of a brant passing overhead. Then the boy laughed. Easy enough, he muttered, and picking up the musket, he leaned once more out over the river and thrust the steel barrel of the gun hard into the mud just below the hole. Then, stepping easily down, he sat squarely into the breach, the gun like a stake in front of him, sticking up between his knees. Then he laughed again as he caught his breath, for he had squeezed into the hole like a stopper into a bottle, his big oilskins filling the breach completely. The water stood above the middle of the breast, and the tide was still rising. Darkness had now settled, but the ghostly ice cakes, tipping, slipping toward him, were spectral white. He had to shove them back as now and the one rose before his face. The sky was black, and the deep water below him was blacker, and how cold it was. Dr. Sam had been stopped by the flooded roads on his way home, and lights shone in the windows as he entered the village. He turned a little out of his way and halted in front of a small cottage near the bridge. "Is Joe here?" he asked. "No," answered his mother. "He went down the meadow for muskrats and has not returned yet. He's probably over with the men at the store." Dr. Sam drove on to the store. There was no boy in yellow oilskins in the store. Dr. Sam picked up a lighted lantern. "Come on," he said. "I'm wet, but I want to look at those sluices," and started for the river, followed immediately by the men whom he led in single file out along the bank. Swinging his lantern low, he pushed into the teeth of the gale at a pace that left the line of lights straggling far behind. "What a night," he growled. "If I had a boy of my own." And he threw the light as far as he could over the seething river, and then down over the flooded meadow. Ahead he heard the roar of Five Forks sluice, and swung his lantern high as if to signal it, so like the rush of a coming train was the sound of the waters But the little engineer in yellow oilskins could not see the signal. He had almost ceased to watch. With his arm cramped about his gun, he was still at his post. But the ice cakes floated in and touched him. The water no longer felt cold. On this side, then on that, out over the swollen river, down into the tossing meadow, flared the lantern as the doctor worked his way along. Above the great sluice he paused a moment, then bent his head to the wind and started on, when his foot touched something soft that yielded strangely, sending a shiver over him, and his light fell upon a bunch of 4 dead muskrats lying on the path. Along the meadow-side flashed the lantern, up and over the riverside, and Dr. Sam, reaching quickly down, drew a limp little form in yellow oilskins out of the water as the men behind him came up. A gurgle, a hiss, a small whirlpool sucking at the surface, and the tide was again tearing through the breach that the boy had filled. The men sprang quickly to their task and did it well, while Dr. Sam, shielding the limp little form from the wind, forced a vial of something between the white lips, saying over to himself as he watched the closed eyes open, "If I had a boy of my own, if I had a boy." No, Dr. Sam never had a boy of his own, but he always felt, I think, that the boy of those yellow oilskins was somehow pretty nearly his. After a long, cold winter, how I love the spatter on my face of the first February rain. The little trout brook below me foams and sometimes overruns the road, and as its small noise ascends the hill, I can hear the wind on a great river, the wash of waves against a narrow bank, and the muffled roar of quaking sluices, as when a February freshet is on.